Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have House passes bill criminalizing gender-affirming care for minors, posted by Dr. Who 07, and that's a YouTube video from Way31 News, WAAY 31 News. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for a lot of what's marketing as gender-affirming care for minors. But, ultimately, if kids want to justify what they want to justify, they have every right to do whatever they want to do. But, ultimately, Reddit always says, oh, what about child marriage? But, they're completely fine with minors getting whatever surgeries they want, including, like, top and bottom surgery. And it just goes to show you that, that they think kids should be able to do whatever they want to, as long as, it doesn't. But they'll still say, oh, the GOP wants child marriage, and it just goes to show you that these people have no principles. And if kids want to justify what they want to justify when it comes to drugs, hormones, or surgeries, I think they should be able to. But if you sell a kid heroin, that should definitely be stigmatized. And the same for a lot of what's marketing as gender affirming care. A lot of what's marketing as gender affirming care is simply sex change surgeries. And Reddit says that's not true. But they say, well, and then they show them instances where it is true. And they say, oh, that's only just a few instances. And they always move the goalpost. And that's just very much Reddit for you. They'll always move the goalpost to bend things to fit their narrative. And that's what my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, if inflation is lower, why is my grocery bill higher? Posted by Ragnarok Hickstry, and that's a cross post from the inflation subreddit. And that's a guy who named Maine, who tweeted, inflation is lower than expected. Look how much data is missing from Trump's government. They're cooking the books. Go to your grocery store and tell me if you think prices are lower. And I responded to this post on another subreddit and I said, I remember Reddit made every excuse for inflation during the Biden years, but now that the orange man is back in power, suddenly it's a pressing issue to them. And it just goes to show you that, Reddit has no values, only orange man bad, pretty much, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have a particular liberal subreddit got taken over by particular ideological strain associated with a particular institute, hosted by USMCBF, and they added, I'm being vague on purpose. If you're smart, you can figure it out. I noticed they required a significant change made to one of the medium-sized liberal/libertarian subreddits, but served as an alternative by the bigger ones. The community in particular has been a pretty decent source of information in discourse regarding liberalism and libertarianism past for many. I'm not exactly happy about the change, as it prevents discussion independent of a particular student of that particular strain of thought. It's shameful because I have not really imagined, let's say 5 more years ago, that it would get to that point where the liberal libertarian movement is being corroded from within. I think they mean that the classical liberal subreddit got taken over by, more right-wing mods. But, on that note, Reddit's pretty much a leftist circle jerk, and the, leftist mods can take over like 95% of subreddits and no one will care. But, rightist mods can take over like 1 or 2 subreddits and everyone loses their minds. And that just really goes to show you how Reddit works, Reddit, this subreddit's a leftist circle jerk has banned me for over years by claiming to be uncensored. I even made the subreddit logo, but no one cares. But the rightists take over another subreddit, and suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump signs order expediting marijuana reclassification after lobbying from cannabis industry from CNN.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added something good out of a shitstorm of awful. And I would agree with that. I personally think, marijuana shouldn't have been as scheduled as high as it was. It should definitely be a lower scheduled drug. And if it was up to libertarians, all drugs would be legal. But, ultimately, I would say, marijuana definitely should be more on the alcohol level than like on the heroin or cocaine or fentanyl level. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have U.S. inflation 1790 to 2015, visualizing economics, from visualizingeconomics.com, was by Plasma 30, and they added, tell me again how the Federal Reserve Bank is a good thing. And they show the chart, and it looks like for the Federal Reserve, and that's when it starts crawling up. Well, it really starts crawling up after in the 70s, it looks like. But I definitely do think, getting rid of the gold standard in 71, that was really, looks like what started good inflation line going up. But yeah, the Federal Reserve, I definitely do think helped when it comes to, the government having complete control over money, and it was allowed to print however much money it feels like, and that definitely leads to inflation. It's very much like how during COVID, that they would give everyone stimulus checks, which led to them printing tons of money, which led to more inflation, and that just goes to show you, if you want to stop inflation, you gotta stop printing so much money. But with the Fed, they can print as much money as they feel like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have House rejects measure to bar strikes inside Venezuela from NewYorkTimes.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added the Democratic measure was defeated mostly along party lines, along with another resolution that would have halted the military's escalating campaign of boat attacks. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but that's how it's gonna be sometimes. The government's not gonna always rule how you want them to. Next, we have how Trudeau, I think they meant Trump, but it looks like they mistyped it. Epstein bonding over pursuing woman from NewYorkTimes.com, posted by Monday, Immature Teen added, the tale seems to be misleading and seems like Trump's Epstein bond over the pure girls, not woman. Excerpt below, Tina Davis, who modeled for Ford in the mid-1990s, said in an interview that her Ford broker instructed her to get dressed up and attend a Mar-a-Lago party in late 1994. Just 14 and new to Miami, she was told to dress sexy, according to her mother, Sandra Coleman, who had accompanied her to Florida. 8 or 9 of her models came along on the bus. All the girls were really young, Miss Coleman recalled in the interview. Some of them could have been in training bras. When they arrived at Mar-a-Lago, Miss Coleman said her daughter was promptly handed a glass of champagne. She took it away, but waiters kept offering more. Each time one of the middle-aged men at the party approached her daughter, Miss Coleman would walk off and introduce herself as Miss Davis's mother. But that's not even the worst of it. During a trip to the bathroom, they ran into Mr. Trump's new wife, whom they had met earlier. Miss Maples clasped her hands, Miss Coleman recalled, and looked her in the eye. Whatever you do, not let her around any of these men, especially my husband, she told Miss Coleman, protect her. And then they had, I'm sure this surprises no one. And yeah, personally, I don't really think Trump's that upstanding moral character. This isn't too surprising to me. But of course, Reddit, when they only care about Epstein's relation to Trump and no one else, and it just goes to show you that, like with the people who worship Trump, you have Trump deification syndrome where you can do nothing but worship Trump and talk about how good he is. You have Trump deranged syndrome where you talk about, or you're only focused on how bad Trump is. And, you should care more about politics than just Trump. But of course, Reddit, they can't see beyond Trump a lot of the time, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have what a quote-unquote libertarian policy to ban an entire racial group from getting guns, posted by Smiley P, and that's cross-post from the forwards from Plan Ma subreddit, and that's a tweet from Libertarian Party New Hampshire, who tweeted, "No guns for blacks. This is that's sensible gun control. If you're not willing to start there by tackling these problems first, you're not serious about gun control. Now let's talk about sensible voter control." And then they did another post, reading comprehension test. The above post advocate banning guns for blacks. 71% voted yes, 90% voted no, 10% voted I can't read. And there were 14,856 votes. And yeah, personally, that's just kind of the Libertarian Party in New Hampshire for you. They like to do kind of trolling like that. And yeah, personally, I think, it's very much a good satire of how gun control, if we were to implement it, we do have to go through the biggest issue first. And one of the biggest issues first is gang violence, which is mostly among the African American community. And I think that's kind of their point. If that being said, the Libertarian Party in New Hampshire is very much like the edgelord, and this could be another example of that, I would say. And it's their philosophy is very much any press is good press. So ultimately, if they want to say that, I personally don't really care for a lot of the edgelording, but if they want to say whatever edgelord shit they want, I think the libertarian positions we need to allow for maximum freedom of speech. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Texas state troopers were stationed in front of the women's restroom in the state capitol building, effectively to prevent trans women from entering, posted by Smiley P, and that's cross-post from the A Boring Dystopia subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care. I think that's mostly just political theater. But if they want to put the state troopers and have them guard the restrooms in the state capitol building, the government can justify putting the state troopers wherever it wants to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have How is the Mises Institute Libertarian, posted by Mundane Image for Routine. They added, I don't know much about the Libertarian Institute, but from a quick search, it seems it promotes a type of Darwinian view of society in which elites are seen as natural and any intervention by the government or on behalf of social justice is destructive, and holds that because beliefs of selective mating, marriage, and the laws of civil and genetic inheritance, positions of natural authority were likely to be passed on from few noble families, and then they link to the source. And it seems like one of the key players, Murray Rothbard, has some questionable things that go against liberty. Is there something I'm missing about the Mises Institute? And yeah, personally, the Mises Institute, they can be more a bit right-wing libertarian. Of course, Reddit, they think libertarianism is all left-wing circles or pretty much communism. And, ultimately, if anyone wants to be considered themselves libertarian, that's fine. Maybe in some instances, if like you're a libertarian, if you consider yourself to be like a libertarian fascist or a libertarian communist, I personally don't think those can be that libertarian. Maybe if they're voluntary. But, ultimately, libertarian is very much a label that, people are going to justify using whatever they feel like. And it's more right-coded, so Reddit doesn't like that. But, it's very much a lost word in that regard when it comes to being right or left. Same like with liberal and the left, liberals are always going to be associated with the left pretty much, even though, modern liberalism very much is very different from classical liberalism, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Don's Best Friend, How Epstein and Trump Bonded Over the Pursuit of Woman, from nytimes.com, posted by The Way to Beauty, and we already talked about that in another post, so we'll move on to the next one. Next, we have Trump announces Patriot Games with 2 high school athletes from each state, from thehill.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, Welcome to the Hunger Games, this should distract people. And I thought that, this is very much Trump baiting people, say, oh, it's just the Hunger Games, even though, it's that's just very much a distraction. It's just another distraction from, what's really going on. And that's very much a lot of what Trump does, he just trying to distract from whatever is going on with stupid shit. It's like how he puts his own name on the side of the Kennedy Center. Ultimately, that's if you're not in the view of the Kennedy Center, that's not an issue. I think that's that prominent. I would say that if you don't like it, you can just ignore it. But that's a lot. Reddit always takes the bait every single time with whatever stupid shit Trump says. I personally, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Fentanyl as WMD, Trump's style lie for the next hemisphere war, posted from exitnow7.wordpress.com, posted by RawDraw4713, and I responded to this post on another subreddit because, as I said earlier, they banned me from this one like hundreds of episodes ago, so I can't respond on this one. I said, personally, I don't really care for it, but the libertarian position has always been to be against the war on drugs. It's very much how how you can personally be against gambling, but if other people want to throw all their money at DraftKings and FanDuel, they should be able to. I do think fentanyl is deadly a lot of the time, but if people want to justify doing whatever they want with it, that's very much a libertarian position. If people end up being stupid and killing themselves, sometimes that's how life works. Sometimes people are going to kill themselves, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Blanche says DOJ won't release Epstein files to Congress by Friday deadline, from thehill.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, ultimately, if the government doesn't want to release the files, they ultimately can't be forced to if they don't feel like it. But ultimately, I think Reddit, they'll never accept the Epstein files because they won't bring down the people because people will just move on to the next thing. As I said in past episodes, they can only really be underwhelming at this point. They've been so built up. So, eventually I think they'll come out, where it will say, oh, they're too censored, they don't, and eventually people will just move on to the next thing. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have, they prosecuted the Capitol rioters. Now the rioters and the DOJ are after them, from Reuters.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And they added, after Trump's mass pardons of the U.S. Capitol rioters, some have gained influence inside the Justice Department, meeting with the officials to push for prosecutions of the federal lawyers who once helped convict them. Reuters found the January 6 prosecutors described mounting threats, harassment, and fear of lasting damage to the U.S. justice system. And yeah, personally, it just goes to show you that the state can prosecute whoever it feels like, even those who used to be the prosecutors. And that just goes, ultimately, it's personally why I don't care for the legal system at all. It's inherently going to be in the hands of whoever has the motives and agenda to do what. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have tech moguls close to Trump see the midterms as a path to long-term power. Post from WashingtonPost.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added the Silicon Valley push hopes to dramatically extend the giants in the tech industry has reaped from the gains from the second term of President Donald Trump. He has struck down AI restrictions introduced by his predecessor Joe Biden, and last week signed an executive order threatening to sue states that pass laws on AI. State legislators introduced more than 1,000 bills regulating AI in 2025, according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, you shouldn't be regulating stuff like AI. You shouldn't be regulating anything. It's not the government's job to tell you what you can and can't regulate. And I do think that's good. I don't really care for the reasons he's doing it because the Silicon Valley elites are telling him to. But I do think that's probably one of the better things Trump is doing is overriding states' regulations on AI. I do think the state government, they can be authoritarian just like the federal government can. I do think we should allow for states' rights as much as possible. But sometimes the federal government can enforce states to enact more libertarian positions, and overriding their regulations on AI is an example of that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Israel-American billionaire Miriam Adelson offered Trump another $250 million to run for a third term, and then in parentheses bribes greater than sign a constitution, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross post from the underreported news subreddit. And that's a headline report from billionaire Miriam Adelson offering another $250 million to run for third term. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, you got that's a lot of politics for you. You got to follow the money, and it just goes to show you how in Israel's pockets he is when an Israeli American billionaire is telling him to run for third term and giving him $250 million if he wants to do so. And it just goes to show you that who's really controlling him. A lot of writers will say Russia, 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 but I always say it's more Israel, Israel, Israel than Russia, Russia, Russia. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump regime sending warning letters to companies selling breast binders from FDE.gov, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, I think the free market is, if you want to sell whatever you want to, you should be able to, and the government shouldn't be able to stop you. So that's my thoughts there. I don't think they should be sending warning labels to companies selling breast binders. But I don't really care for the breast binders and all the related to all the transgender shit. But ultimately the free market is, sell whatever you want to without fear of the government sending you any warning letters. Next, we have Putin vows no more wars if West treats Russia with respect, posted from BBC.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross-post from the Not the Onion subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Putin. I don't think he should have invaded Ukraine. But that being said, there was a lot. You could see how he could justify if the U.S. turned Ukraine pretty much into a puppet state, and how Russia is pretty much increasingly surrounded by NATO on its western front. And how the U.S. wanted Ukraine to join NATO, and soon, the Russia will just pretty much be bordered by only NATO and then the Western region, and that just goes to show you that if the West was treating Russia with more respect, maybe Putin wouldn't have invaded in the first place, because when it's like if China took over Mexico and Canada, the U.S. would be rightfully afraid of that. But, when the U.S. does the same with Eastern Europe, suddenly, people don't care anymore. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have U.S. Representative Thomas Massie confident release of Epstein files won't have heavy redactions from what11.com, posted by Donald Key. And that's a cross-post from the Thomas Massie subreddit. And, personally, I do think, there might be some redactions, but, very much, it's Reddit, they're never going to accept the Epstein files as the government releases them, because, they've been too built up at this point. If they don't bring down everyone who they don't like, especially the Orange Man, they'll just move on to the next thing. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then there was a post in the Libertarian Party USA subreddit I made that I wanted to share. I said, do you think that the collapse of the current U.S. system, government, economic, etc., would be a net benefit or a net drawback for libertarians? And I said, if I don't think it gets as close as a lot of Reddit doomers think it is, but it's still an interesting question to ask. I personally could go either way. I would say that any extremely centralized system is not libertarian. That includes the current one, but the system that replaces it will likely be worse in that regard. I think we as libertarians need to focus on creating decentralized systems instead rather than big centralized ones like we have currently. Thoughts. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Yeah, personally, I wouldn't really care if the U.S. collapses. I don't think the current system is that libertarian. But people will move on and adapt to whatever is coming, and that's very much how life. You gotta do it. Life a lot of the time. You gotta adapt to whatever is currently happening, and that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.